The cold wind whistled through the barren streets of Bannack, Montana, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a harsh winter, as Lillian Lawson clutched her wailing infant to her chest and staggered forward, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. Tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face, mingling with the light snowfall that had begun to descend upon the mining town. 3 days without food had left her dizzy and weak, yet still she pressed on, desperate to find shelter before nightfall claimed what little warmth the day had offered. "Hush now, Samuel," she whispered to her 2-month-old son, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "We'll find somewhere, my love. We'll find something." But her words rang hollow even to her own ears. Bannack had shown her nothing but cruelty since her arrival. Her husband Thomas had brought her west with promises of gold and prosperity, only to abandon her for a saloon girl after Samuel's birth. Then yesterday, the boarding house owner had tossed her meager belongings onto the street when she couldn't produce the weekly rent. The sky darkened as Lillian made her way toward the outskirts of town, where she'd heard an old church might take in those with nowhere else to go. But as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, she realized with growing dread that she'd lost her way. The buildings had thinned out, replaced by scattered homesteads and ranches. Samuel's cries grew more insistent, his tiny body shivering despite being wrapped in the only blanket she'd managed to save. Lillian's milk had begun to dry up from her own hunger, leaving her baby as famished as she was. When she spotted the warm glow of lantern light from a modest ranch house about 100 yards ahead, Lillian nearly wept with relief. Perhaps they would at least allow her to warm herself by their fire before continuing her journey. Gathering what little strength remained, she trudged through the ankle-deep snow toward the property. As she approached the small cabin with its adjacent barn, a dog's bark cut through the stillness of the evening. The door to the cabin swung open, and a tall figure emerged, rifle in hand. "Who goes there?" called a deep voice, wary but not immediately threatening. "Please," Lillian called out, her voice barely carrying across the distance. "I mean no harm. I just need—" Her words died as her legs finally gave out, sending her crumpling to the snow-covered ground. Samuel clutched protectively against her chest. The last thing she heard was the sound of boots crunching through snow as the figure ran toward her. Gabriel Findlay had been preparing for a quiet evening alone with only his dog Kaiser for company when he'd heard the commotion outside. At 32, he'd grown accustomed to solitude on his small cattle ranch outside Bannack. The son of a Missouri farmer who'd taught him the value of hard work and compassion, Gabriel had ventured west after the war, wanting nothing more than peace and a chance to build something of his own. He hadn't expected to find an unconscious woman, and her crying baby collapsed in the snow near his property line. "Dear God," he muttered as he scooped the woman into his arms, careful not to disturb the wailing infant strapped to her chest. She weighed almost nothing, he realized with alarm, and her skin was ice-cold to the touch. The baby's cries were weakening, which worried him even more. Gabriel carried them swiftly to his cabin, nudging the door open with his boot and stepping into the welcoming warmth of his home. Kaiser, his faithful cattle dog, followed close behind, whining anxiously. "It's all right, boy," Gabriel assured the dog as he gently laid the woman on his bed. The cabin wasn't much, just one main room with a small bedroom partitioned off, but it was warm and dry, the fire in the stone hearth casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The woman stirred slightly as Gabriel carefully unbundled the infant from her arms. The child, a boy from the looks of him, couldn't have been more than a few months old. His cries had subsided to whimpers, his tiny face pinched with hunger and cold. "You poor little fella," Gabriel murmured, cradling the baby awkwardly in one arm while he stoked the fire with his free hand. He'd never had much experience with children, but he knew enough to recognize a hungry baby when he saw one. The woman on the bed moaned softly, her eyelids fluttering. "Madam," Gabriel approached cautiously, still holding the infant. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of summer honey. For a moment, confusion clouded her features. Then panic seized her as she realized her child was no longer in her arms. "Samuel!" she cried, attempting to sit up only to fall back against the pillow, too weak to rise. "My baby, where is he?" "He's right here, madam," Gabriel said quickly, stepping closer so she could see the child. "He's safe. You both collapsed outside. I brought you in." Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to trespass. We were looking for the church, but I got turned around in the snow." "The church is clear on the other side of town," Gabriel informed her gently. "You're about 3 miles off course." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was so confused. We haven't eaten in days." The words struck Gabriel like a physical blow. "Days?" he repeated, appalled. Before she could respond, the baby began to cry again, a pitiful, hungry sound that tugged at something deep within Gabriel's chest. "I don't have much milk left," the woman confessed, tears streaming down her face. "I haven't been able to feed him properly." Gabriel nodded, making a swift decision. "I've got some cow's milk from this morning's milking. It's not the same as mother's milk, but it's better than nothing for now. And I've got stew on the stove for you, madam." "Lillian," she said softly. "Lillian Lawson." "Gabriel Findlay," he replied with a nod. "Rest easy, Mrs. Lawson. You and your boy are safe now." He carefully handed Samuel back to his mother before moving to the small kitchen area. As he warmed the milk and prepared a bowl of venison stew, he glanced back at the woman on his bed. Her clothes were worn and dirty, but had once been of good quality. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with chestnut hair that fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, there was a quiet dignity about her that impressed him. "Where's your husband, Mrs. Lawson?" Gabriel asked as he returned with a cup of diluted warm milk and a spoon. A shadow crossed her face. "Gone," she said simply. He found gold fever more appealing than a wife and newborn son. Gabriel felt a surge of anger toward this unknown man who had abandoned his family. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Here, let me show you how to feed the little one. My sister had a baby last year when I visited back home, so I've seen how they do it." With gentle guidance, he showed Lillian how to dribble small amounts of the milk into Samuel's eager mouth using the spoon. The baby suckled desperately, his tiny hands clenching and unclenching with relief as nourishment finally filled his empty belly. Once Samuel had taken enough milk to quiet his cries, Gabriel helped Lillian sit up against the headboard and handed her the bowl of stew. "Eat slowly," he advised. "Your stomach won't be used to food after so long without." Lillian nodded, taking a small spoonful of the rich broth. The moment the flavor hit her tongue, tears sprang to her eyes again. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Gabriel shook his head, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No need for that. Couldn't very well leave you out there to freeze, could I? Anyone would have done the same." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Bannack had its share of good people, but also those who wouldn't spare a second glance for a woman down on her luck. The gold rush had brought all kinds to Montana territory, including those who saw vulnerability as something to exploit. "Where are you from originally, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, pulling up a chair near the bed while giving her enough space not to feel crowded. "St. Louis," she replied between careful spoonfuls of stew. "Thomas, my husband, was a clerk at a shipping company there. When news of the gold strikes reached us, he couldn't talk of anything else. I was already with child when we set out last spring." A bitter smile touched her lips. He promised we'd return to St. Louis wealthy beyond imagination. Gabriel nodded. He'd heard similar stories 100 times before. The gold fever takes men that way, makes them forget what's truly valuable. Lillian's gaze dropped to her son, now sleeping peacefully in the crook of her arm. Yes, she agreed softly. It does. They fell into silence as she continued to eat, and Gabriel busied himself with stoking the fire and laying out some blankets on the floor for himself. He'd give the bed to Lillian and the baby for the night. Tomorrow he could figure out what came next. You don't have to sleep on the floor, Lillian protested when she realized what he was doing. We've imposed enough. We can move on come morning. Move on to where? Exactly? Gabriel asked more bluntly than he'd intended. When she didn't answer, he softened his tone. You and the little one need rest and proper food. I've got a spare room in the back. It's little more than a storage space right now, but I can clear it out tomorrow. You're welcome to stay until you get back on your feet. Lillian stared at him, clearly stunned by the offer. You don't know me, she said finally. I could be anyone. Gabriel chuckled. I reckon I'm a fair judge of character, Mrs. Lawson. Besides, Kaiser here would let me know if you had ill intentions. He nodded toward the cattle dog, who had settled at the foot of the bed, his watchful eyes moving between the newcomers and his master. Despite her exhaustion, Lillian smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, hinting at the beauty that hardship had temporarily dimmed. Then we accept your hospitality, Mr. Findlay, just until I can find work in town. Gabriel nodded, satisfied. Good. That's settled then. He hesitated, then added, and it's Gabriel, please. Mr. Findlay was my father. Then you must call me Lillian, she replied, setting aside the now empty bowl. Her eyelids were growing heavy, the warmth and food working their magic on her depleted body. Rest now, Lillian, Gabriel said softly, taking the bowl. You're safe here. As he watched her drift into sleep, her son nestled securely against her side. Gabriel felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. Life had taught him to be cautious about letting others into his carefully constructed world. But something about Lillian Lawson and her infant son had bypassed those defenses in the space of a single evening. Whatever came next, he knew with sudden certainty that his quiet, solitary existence had just undergone a profound change. The early morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows as Gabriel quietly moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast. He'd spent the night on the floor near the hearth, Kaiser curled at his side, but had risen before dawn as was his habit. There were animals to tend to, regardless of unexpected guests. After feeding and watering his small herd of cattle and the 2 horses in the barn, he'd returned to find Lillian and Samuel still fast asleep. The baby was making soft cooing sounds in his sleep, his tiny fist resting against his mother's cheek. The sight had stopped Gabriel in his tracks, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. Now, as he cooked cornmeal mush and fried salt pork on the cast-iron stove, he heard Lillian stirring in the bedroom. Good morning, he called softly, not wanting to startle her. Breakfast is nearly ready if you're hungry. There was a moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps as Lillian appeared in the doorway, Samuel cradled in her arms. She'd clearly attempted to make herself presentable, smoothing her hair and straightening her rumpled dress as best she could. I can't remember the last time I slept so soundly, she admitted, her voice still rough with sleep. Samuel, too, he usually wakes several times in the night. Gabriel smiled, gesturing for her to take a seat at the small wooden table. Hunger can be exhausting. How are you feeling this morning? Better, she said, settling into the chair. Still weak, but better. Thank you. Gabriel nodded, spooning the cornmeal mush into bowls and adding a generous dollop of molasses to each. "I've got some more milk for the little one," he said, placing the food on the table along with a cup of coffee for Lillian. "And there's a pump out back if you'd like to freshen up after breakfast." Lillian's eyes widened at the spread before her. "This is too much. It's just breakfast," Gabriel interrupted gently. "Eat while it's hot." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, broken only by the occasional contented gurgle from Samuel, who seemed fascinated by the new surroundings, his eyes tracking the movements of Kaiser, who sat attentively nearby. "Your dog is very well behaved," Lillian observed, following Samuel's gaze. Gabriel smiled fondly at the dog. "Kaiser's been with me for 6 years now. Best cattle dog I've ever seen, and good company too." "You live out here all alone?" Lillian asked, curiosity evident in her tone. Gabriel nodded, sipping his coffee. "Just me and Kaiser. I prefer the quiet. Town gets too rowdy for my taste, especially since the gold strike." "How long have you been in Bannack?" "Going on 3 years now. Came out after the war, looking for a fresh start." Gabriel didn't elaborate on his experiences during the conflict. Those memories were best left buried. "Worked as a ranch hand for a while, saved up enough to buy this place last year. It's not much, but the grazing's good, and I've managed to build up a small herd." Lillian glanced around the cabin. Though simple, it was clean and well-maintained, with a few personal touches that spoke of permanence: a bookshelf with a dozen or so volumes, a rocking chair near the fire, a colorful quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "Peaceful." A faint flush colored Gabriel's tan cheeks at the compliment. "It suits me, though I reckon it could use a woman's touch." The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them, fearing Lillian might misconstrue his meaning. "That is, I didn't mean." To his relief, Lillian laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet cabin. "I understand, Gabriel. And you're right, a curtain or two wouldn't go amiss." Her laughter transformed her, and Gabriel found himself staring. In the morning light, with some color returning to her cheeks, Lillian Lawson was strikingly beautiful. Her eyes, which he'd thought merely brown in the dim light of the previous evening, were in fact a warm amber, flecked with gold. Her chestnut hair, though in need of washing, fell in natural waves past her shoulders. Realizing he was staring, Gabriel cleared his throat and stood abruptly, gathering the empty dishes. "I should show you where everything is. I've got some chores to attend to this morning, but you're welcome to rest or explore the property." "I'd like to help," Lillian said, rising as well with Samuel in her arms. "I'm not used to idleness, and I feel I should earn my keep somehow." Gabriel started to protest that no payment was expected, but the determined set of Lillian's jaw told him she wouldn't be easily dissuaded. Pride was a powerful force, and he sensed that Lillian Lawson had little else to cling to at the moment. "Very well," he conceded, "though I insist you take it easy today. Perhaps you could help with mending? I've a basket of clothes that could use attention, if you're handy with a needle." "I am," she confirmed, relief evident in her expression. "And perhaps I could prepare supper? I'm a decent cook when I have ingredients to work with." Gabriel smiled. "That would be welcome. I can't claim my cooking is anything special." With the matter settled, Gabriel showed Lillian around the property: the pump for fresh water, the small vegetable garden now dormant under a layer of snow, the root cellar where he stored preserved foods, the chicken coop with its 6 hens, and finally the barn where he kept his horses and the milk cow. "This is Daisy," he said, patting the cow's flank affectionately. "She's getting on in years, but still gives sweet milk." Samuel, who had been quiet throughout the tour, suddenly gave an excited coo and waved his tiny hands toward the animal. Lillian laughed, holding him up so he could better see. "I think he approves," she said, smiling at Gabriel over her shoulder. Something shifted in Gabriel's chest at the sight mother and child, bathed in the soft light streaming through the barn door, looking momentarily carefree despite their circumstances. It had been a long time since his home had contained such warmth. "Well then," he said, his voice gruffer than intended as he worked to contain unfamiliar emotions. "I need to mend part of the north fence this morning. Should take me a few hours. You'll be all right?" Lillian nodded, her expression turning serious once more. "We will. And Gabriel, thank you, truly." He ducked his head in acknowledgement, suddenly unable to meet her gaze. "It's nothing, just being neighborly." But as he gathered his tools and headed toward the pasture, Kaiser trotting faithfully at his heels, Gabriel knew it was far from nothing. In the space of less than a day, Lillian Lawson and her son had somehow slipped past defenses he'd spent years building. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Whatever came next, he suspected life would never quite be the same. The days slipped into a comfortable routine as November deepened toward winter. Lillian and Samuel remained at Gabriel's ranch, their temporary stay extending as the first major snowstorm of the season blanketed Bannack and the surrounding countryside in 3 feet of snow, making travel into town impossible. Gabriel found himself surprisingly content with the arrangement. Lillian had proven herself hardworking and resourceful, taking on household tasks with quiet efficiency. The cabin had undergone subtle but meaningful changes. Curtains fashioned from spare fabric now adorned the windows. The floors were swept twice daily, and meals had become something to anticipate rather than merely consume. Samuel, too, was thriving. With proper nourishment, the infant had grown plumper, his earlier fretfulness replaced by cheerful babbling and an infectious laugh that never failed to bring a smile to Gabriel's face. Even Kaiser had fallen under the baby's spell, often stationing himself beside the blanket where Samuel played, as vigilant as if the child were a wayward calf in need of protection. On this particular evening, nearly 3 weeks after Lillian and Samuel's arrival, Gabriel returned from tending the cattle to find the cabin filled with the mouth-watering aroma of baking bread and simmering stew. Stamping the snow from his boots on the porch, he entered to find Lillian at the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot. Samuel lay on his blanket near the fire, attempting with great concentration to roll from his back to his stomach. "Something smells amazing," Gabriel said by way of greeting, hanging his coat and hat on the pegs by the door. Lillian turned, her face flushed from the heat of the stove. "I hope you don't mind. I found some dried apples in the cellar and made a pie." It seemed like a day that called for something sweet. "Mind? I can't remember the last time I had apple pie." Gabriel crouched beside Samuel, gently tickling the baby's belly. "And how's the little cowpoke today?" Samuel answered with a gleeful gurgle, grabbing for Gabriel's fingers with surprising strength. "He's been trying to roll over all afternoon," Lillian said, watching them with a smile. "Almost managed it a few times." Gabriel chuckled as Samuel finally succeeded in his mission, flopping onto his stomach with a look of triumph. "There you go, partner. Soon enough you'll be running circles around your ma." "Heaven help me," Lillian laughed, ladling stew into bowls. "He's growing so fast already. His clothes barely fit anymore." "We could ride into town once the snow clears a bit," Gabriel suggested, rising to wash his hands in the basin by the door. "Get him some new things. You too, if you'd like." A shadow crossed Lillian's face as she set the bowls on the table. "I couldn't ask you to do that. You've already done so much, and I have no way to pay you back yet." Gabriel took his seat across from her, noting how she avoided his gaze. "It's not about paying back, Lillian. I'm happy to help. But that's just it," she said softly. "I can't keep accepting your charity. I need to find work to support Samuel properly." Gabriel frowned, his stew momentarily forgotten. "Is that what you think this is? Charity? Isn't it?" She finally looked up, her amber eyes troubled. You took in 2 strangers out of the goodness of your heart. Fed us, clothed us, sheltered us. And in return, what have I offered except basic household chores any hired girl could do? That's not, Gabriel began, then stopped, choosing his words carefully. Yes, I took you in because you needed help. But these past weeks, having you both here. He faltered, unaccustomed to expressing such thoughts aloud. The cabins never felt so much like a home as it does now. Lillian's eyes widened slightly at his admission, and for a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and Samuel's contented babbling from his spot on the floor. I've been thinking, Gabriel continued when the silence stretched too long. The snow will make travel difficult for at least another month. Even if you found work in town, getting back and forth would be near impossible until spring. He took a deep breath. Stay here for the winter, Lillian. You and Samuel both. When spring comes, if you still want to find work in town, I'll help you get settled. Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. That's too generous, Gabriel. I can't. You can, he interrupted gently. Truth is, I'd welcome the company. Winters get mighty long out here alone. He managed a small smile. Besides, Kaiser would never forgive me if I sent his favorite little person away. At the mention of his name, the dog lifted his head from his paws, looking between them with intelligent eyes. Lillian laughed despite herself, the tension easing from her shoulders. Well, we certainly couldn't disappoint Kaiser, she said, her voice lighter. But I insist on contributing something. Perhaps. She hesitated, then continued with more confidence. Perhaps I could help with your accounts? I noticed your ledger on the desk. My father was an accountant, and he taught me the basics. I could organize your records, make sure you're not being cheated by the cattle buyers. Gabriel blinked in surprise. Few women he knew had any interest in figures and accounts. You'd do that? I'd be happy to, Lillian said, her expression brightening. It would make me feel useful beyond just cooking and cleaning. Then we have a deal, Gabriel said, extending his hand across the table. You'll stay through winter, help with the accounts, and come spring, we'll reassess. Lillian placed her small hand in his much larger one, the touch sending an unexpected current through Gabriel's arm. Deal, she agreed, a genuine smile lighting her features. As they finished their meal and moved on to the apple pie, which proved to be as delicious as it smelled, the conversation flowed more easily. Lillian spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, of her father's work and her mother's skill with watercolors. Gabriel shared stories of growing up on his family's farm in Missouri, of learning to ride almost before he could walk, and of his 3 siblings still living back east. Later, after Lillian had put Samuel to bed in the small side room Gabriel had cleared for them, they sat before the fire, enjoying the peaceful end to the day. Gabriel whittled a small wooden horse, a gift for Samuel, though he didn't say so while Lillian mended one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. May I ask you something? Lillian said after a comfortable silence. Gabriel looked up from his carving. Of course. Why did you never marry? You're kind and capable with a good home. Surely there were women who would have been happy to share your life. The question caught him off guard. Gabriel set aside his whittling, considering how to answer. There was someone once, he said finally, back in Missouri before the war. Caroline was her name. We'd planned to marry when I returned. What happened? Lillian asked softly. She married my cousin while I was away fighting, Gabriel said, the old pain a distant echo now. Can't blame her, really. Many didn't come back, and those who did weren't always the same men who left. He stared into the fire, memories of those dark days flickering like shadows. After that, I headed west. Thought it best to make a fresh start where the land was as new to beginning again as I was. I'm sorry, Lillian said, setting down her sewing. That must have been difficult. Gabriel shrugged, attempting nonchalance. It was a long time ago, and truth be told, I've grown comfortable with my own company. He glanced at her, adding quietly, until recently, that is. Lillian's cheeks colored at his words, and she quickly picked up her sewing again. Samuel and I have certainly disrupted your solitude. In the best possible way, Gabriel assured her, returning to his whittling. In the best possible way. As the fire burned low and the wind whistled around the eaves of the cabin, Gabriel found himself thinking that, for the first time in years, he no longer dreaded the long winter ahead. Instead, he looked forward to snowbound days in the warmth of his home, with Lillian's quiet presence and Samuel's joyful discoveries to brighten the darkness. It was a dangerous line of thinking, he knew. Lillian wasn't his, nor was her son. Come spring, she would likely move on, seeking independence and a life of her own making. But for now, in the gentle quiet of a Montana winter's night, Gabriel allowed himself to imagine what might be, rather than what had been or what would come. December arrived with biting cold and a series of snowstorms that effectively isolated Gabriel's ranch from town. The days fell into a rhythm as familiar as breathing, Gabriel rising before dawn to tend the animals, Lillian preparing breakfast by lamplight, their breaths visible in the cold morning air until the fire was stoked to full strength. Samuel, growing stronger by the day, now rolled with ease and had begun attempting to sit up on his own, his determination bringing laughter to both adults. On this particular morning, 2 weeks before Christmas, Gabriel had just returned from the barn when Lillian approached him with an anxious expression. "Samuel has a fever," she said without preamble. "It started during the night. I thought perhaps he was just warm from the fire, but it's worsened since dawn." Gabriel immediately followed her to the side room, where Samuel lay in the small bed they'd fashioned from a wooden crate lined with soft blankets. The baby's normally rosy cheeks were flushed scarlet, his breathing slightly labored. When Gabriel gently placed a hand on the infant's forehead, the heat radiating from his skin was alarming. "How long has he been like this?" Gabriel asked, fear coiling in his gut. He'd seen sickness sweep through communities, taking the youngest and oldest first. "The fever started last night, but he was still playing and eating normally," Lillian said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "This morning he wouldn't nurse, and he's been fussy and crying." Gabriel straightened, mind racing. "We need to get his fever down. Do you know any remedies?" Lillian nodded. "My mother used willow bark tea for fevers, but I don't know if that's safe for an infant. And I don't have any willow bark." "There's a stand of willows by the creek," Gabriel said, already moving toward his coat. "And my mother swore by cool compresses. Let's try both." Despite the bitter cold, Gabriel made his way to the creek, breaking through the ice to reach the dormant willow trees. He stripped bark from several branches, filling his pockets before trudging back through the snow to the cabin. Inside, Lillian had already set water to boil and was bathing Samuel's feverish body with cool cloths. The baby whimpered weakly, a sound that cut Gabriel to the quick. "Let me prepare the tea," Gabriel said, shaking snow from his clothes. "My sister had a baby with fever last year when I visited." The doctor said to dilute the willow bark tea for infants, just a few drops mixed with milk. Working together, they brewed the tea and coaxed a small amount into Samuel, who initially resisted but then swallowed the mixture. Throughout the day and into the night, they took turns applying cool compresses and administering tiny doses of the willow bark tea. Lillian sang softly to her son, old lullabies and folk songs that seemed to soothe him even in his discomfort. Near midnight, Gabriel insisted Lillian rest while he watched over Samuel. She reluctantly agreed, curling up on the bed but not truly sleeping, her eyes constantly drifting to where Gabriel sat beside her son. "What if we need a doctor?" she whispered into the dim light cast by a single lantern. "The nearest one is in town." Gabriel met her gaze steadily. "If his fever doesn't break by morning, I'll make the ride to Bannack. The trails will be difficult, but I can manage." Lillian nodded, her hand reaching out to grasp his arm. "Thank you, Gabriel. I don't know what we would have done without you." The simple touch and the raw gratitude in her voice affected Gabriel more deeply than he cared to admit. "Try to rest," he said gruffly, patting her hand before returning his attention to Samuel. Around 3 in the morning, as the wind howled outside and the fire burned low in the hearth, Samuel's fever finally broke. Gabriel noticed the change first. The baby's skin, while still warm, no longer burned to the touch, and his breathing had eased. By dawn, Samuel was sleeping peacefully, his color returning to normal. Lillian wept with relief when Gabriel woke her with the news. Without thinking, she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. "He's going to be all right," Gabriel assured her, his arms encircling her waist hesitantly. "He's a strong little fellow." Lillian pulled back slightly, suddenly aware of their closeness, but didn't step away completely. In the pale morning light filtering through the window, Gabriel could see the traces of tears on her cheeks and the shadows beneath her eyes from the sleepless night. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "No need for thanks," Gabriel replied, his voice equally quiet. "I care about him too." The admission hung between them, simple yet profound. In the weeks since their arrival, Samuel had wormed his way into Gabriel's heart as surely as if he'd been his own son. And Lillian? Gabriel pushed the thought away, not yet ready to examine the depth of his feelings for her. Lillian seemed to sense his inner struggle. She stepped back, creating a small distance between them. "You should rest now. You've been up all night." Gabriel nodded, suddenly aware of his exhaustion. "Wake me if there's any change," he said, moving toward his own bed. "I will," she promised. "Sleep well, Gabriel." As he drifted into much-needed slumber, Gabriel's last thought was of the way Lillian had felt in his arms, small but strong, fragile yet resilient, like a wildflower that somehow bloomed despite harsh conditions. For the first time since her arrival, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling in love with Lillian Lawson, and that realization, more than anything, terrified him. Samuel's recovery proved swift, the resilience of youth working in his favor. Within days, he was back to his cheerful self, babbling and attempting to crawl across the cabin floor, much to Kaiser's apparent amusement. The dog had taken to lying directly in the baby's path, forcing Samuel to navigate around or over him, a game that delighted the infant and often had Lillian and Gabriel laughing together. As Christmas approached, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the small cabin. Gabriel found himself watching Lillian when she wasn't looking, the graceful way she moved about the kitchen, the gentle patience she showed with Samuel, the intelligence evident in her discussions of his ranch accounts. Lillian, too, seemed more aware of Gabriel's presence, her cheeks often coloring when their hands accidentally touched or when she caught him observing her. 3 days before Christmas, Gabriel announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. "The trail's clear enough now," he explained over breakfast. "We're running low on flour and coffee, and I thought perhaps we might have something special for Christmas dinner." "That sounds wonderful," Lillian agreed, a wistful expression crossing her face. Samuel's first Christmas should be memorable, even if he's too young to remember it. Gabriel hesitated, then added, "I thought perhaps, if there's anything you'd like for yourself or for Samuel." Lillian shook her head quickly. "You've given us more than enough already. Please don't spend your money on us, Gabriel." "It's my money to spend as I choose," he countered gently. And what good is it if not to bring joy to those He stopped abruptly, almost having said love. To those I care about, he finished. Lillian gazed at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Very well, she said finally. If you insist, perhaps some yarn? I could knit Samuel a warmer cap, and perhaps make something for you as well as a Christmas gift. Gabriel smiled, relieved she'd accepted. Yarn it is. Anything else? A mischievous glint appeared in Lillian's eyes. Surprises are half the fun of Christmas, aren't they? I'll trust your judgment. The ride to Bannack took longer than usual due to the snow-packed trails, but Gabriel barely noticed the time, his thoughts occupied with what gifts might bring Lillian genuine happiness. By the time he reached town, he had a mental list that extended well beyond yarn and basic supplies. Bannack had grown since the gold strike, its main street now lined with businesses catering to miners and settlers alike. Gabriel tethered his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth after the cold ride. Gabriel Findlay. Haven't seen you in weeks, called Frank Wilson, the store's proprietor. Thought maybe the wolves got you. Gabriel chuckled, removing his gloves. Just been keeping to myself, Frank. The usual. Well, you've picked a fine day to come to town, Frank said, leaning on the counter. Just got a shipment in from back east yesterday. All sorts of goods for Christmas. That's fortunate, Gabriel replied, surveying the store's well-stocked shelves. I'll need the usual supplies, plus a few extras. As Gabriel moved through the store, selecting flour, coffee, sugar, and other staples, he also carefully chose items he thought Lillian might appreciate: several skeins of soft yarn in shades of blue and green, a small bottle of lavender-scented hair oil, a length of pretty floral fabric that could become a new dress, and a set of wooden blocks painted in bright colors for Samuel. When he approached the counter with his selections, Frank raised his eyebrows. Yarn and ladies' hair oil? Something you're not telling me. Gabriel felt his neck grow warm. Just some things for friends. Frank's expression was knowing. Must be good friends indeed. When Gabriel didn't elaborate, the storekeeper shrugged and began tallying the purchases. Heard you took in that woman and her baby, the one whose husband ran off with Sadie from the saloon. Gabriel's head snapped up. What did you say? Frank paused, suddenly wary. About the woman staying at your place? Folks have been talking. No, about her husband. Gabriel interrupted. What do you know about him? Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully. Not much. Name's Thomas Lawson, I believe. Been spending his time and whatever money he has left at the Golden Nugget. Word is he lost his claim in a poker game last month and has been drowning his sorrows since. Gabriel absorbed this information silently, anger building in his chest. So Lillian's husband hadn't just abandoned her, he was still in Bannack, gambling and drinking while his wife and child nearly starved. He ever ask about them? His wife and son? Gabriel asked, his voice tight. Frank shook his head. Not that I've heard. Though Sadie moved on to Helena with some miner who struck it rich, so he's been even more in his cups lately. Gabriel paid for his purchases, his earlier joy in selecting gifts for Lillian and Samuel now overshadowed by this new knowledge. As he secured his supplies on his horse, he debated whether to seek out Thomas Lawson. The wiser course would be to return to the ranch, to forget he'd learned of the man's presence in town. But the memory of Lillian collapsing in the snow, her baby crying from hunger, drove him toward the Golden Nugget Saloon. The establishment was already busy despite the early hour, miners and cowboys alike seeking warmth and whiskey to cut the winter chill. Gabriel paused in the doorway, scanning the dimly lit interior until his gaze landed on a figure hunched over a table in the corner. Though he'd never met Thomas Lawson, something about the man's dejected posture and fine but threadbare clothes marked him as different from the other patrons. Gabriel approached slowly, removing his hat as he reached the table. "Thomas Lawson?" The man looked up, squinting through bloodshot eyes. He was younger than Gabriel had expected, perhaps 25, with the remnants of what had once been handsome features now blurred by alcohol and dissipation. "Do I know you?" Thomas slurred, his hand protectively covering his half-empty glass. "No," Gabriel replied coldly, "but I know your wife and son." Thomas blinked, confusion giving way to wariness. "Lillian? What about her?" "She nearly died," Gabriel said bluntly. "She and your son both. Found them collapsed in the snow a month ago, half-starved and freezing." A flicker of shame crossed Thomas's face before he masked it with indifference. "Not my concern anymore." She knew what she was getting into. Coming west. Gabriel's hands curled into fists at his sides. "She came west because she believed in you, because she trusted you to care for her and your child." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Shows how little she knew me then. I'm not cut out for responsibility. Never was." He took another drink. "She's better off without me. The kid too." "On that we agree," Gabriel said, his contempt evident. "But a man pays his debts, Lawson. What do you owe your wife?" Thomas's expression hardened. "I don't owe her anything. Whatever we had is finished." In one swift movement, Gabriel reached across the table and grabbed Thomas by the shirt front, half lifting him from his seat. "You owe her a divorce," he growled, his voice low enough that only Thomas could hear. "Freedom to build a new life without you hanging over her head." Fear flickered in Thomas's eyes. "I can't afford a lawyer," he protested. "And anyway, what's it to you? She your woman now or something?" Gabriel released him with a small shove. "She's a decent person who deserves better than what you gave her. I'll pay for the lawyer. You just sign the papers when they're drawn up." Thomas straightened his rumpled shirt, regarding Gabriel with newfound interest. "You must want her bad," he observed with a smirk. "Fine by me. I'll sign whatever you want." Gabriel resisted the urge to strike the man. "I'll be in touch," he said coldly, turning to leave. "And Lawson, if you ever try to contact her or the boy, you'll answer to me." Outside in the crisp winter air, Gabriel took several deep breaths to calm his racing heart. He hadn't planned to confront Thomas, and he certainly hadn't intended to suggest divorce proceedings. But seeing the man knowing he lived in relative comfort while his family suffered had ignited something protective and fierce within Gabriel. The ride back to the ranch was spent in turmoil, wondering whether he should tell Lillian about his encounter. By the time the cabin came into view, golden light spilling from its windows into the gathering dusk, Gabriel had decided to wait. Christmas was just days away. He wouldn't tarnish it with reminders of past pain. Lillian met him at the door, Samuel on her hip, both smiling welcomingly. The simple sight of them washed away the lingering anger from his confrontation with Thomas, replacing it with something warmer and more profound. "Welcome home," Lillian said, stepping aside to let him enter. "We've missed you." "Have you now?" Gabriel replied, unable to keep the pleasure from his voice as he stomped snow from his boots. Samuel reached for him immediately, a gesture that never failed to touch Gabriel deeply. He took the baby from Lillian, marveling as always at how natural it felt to hold him. "He refused to nap until you returned," Lillian explained, helping Gabriel remove his coat while he balanced Samuel. "Someone has grown quite attached to his Mr. Findlay." "Well, the feeling's mutual, partner," Gabriel told Samuel, who responded by patting Gabriel's bearded cheek with his tiny hand. Later, after supper, when Samuel had finally succumbed to sleep, Gabriel and Lillian sat before the fire sorting through the supplies he'd purchased. Gabriel had intentionally left the personal gifts hidden in the barn, planning to wrap them properly before Christmas. "Frank Wilson says hello," Gabriel mentioned casually, watching Lillian from the corner of his eye. Her hands stilled momentarily. Did he indeed? I only met him once or twice when Thomas and I first arrived in Bannack. Gabriel hesitated, then decided partial honesty was best. He mentioned that Thomas is still in town. Lillian's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. Thomas is in Bannack? All this time? Gabriel nodded reluctantly. Apparently so. Spends most of his time at the saloon, from what Frank said. Lillian was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with sadness. I used to dream he would come looking for us, that he would realize what he'd thrown away and want us back. She shook her head ruefully. How foolish that seems now. It's not foolish to hope, Lillian, Gabriel said gently. Perhaps not, she agreed. But I don't hope for that anymore. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I've learned there are better men in this world than Thomas Lawson. The way she looked at him made Gabriel's heart race. Lillian, would you like some tea? She interrupted, rising suddenly. I should put on the kettle. The moment broken, Gabriel nodded, watching as she busied herself at the stove. There was something different in her manner, now a new resolve in the set of her shoulders. A quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Whatever Lillian's feelings about her husband's continued presence in Bannack, Gabriel sensed she had closed that chapter of her life. The realization filled him with a cautious hope. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sun transforming the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white and gold. Gabriel rose early, as was his custom, to tend to the animals before the festivities began. He'd spent the previous evening wrapping his gifts for Lillian and Samuel in brown paper tied with colorful string, placing them beneath the small pine tree they'd cut and decorated with paper chains and dried berries. When he returned from the barn, he found Lillian already awake, dressed in her best gown with her hair arranged more carefully than usual. Samuel sat on a blanket near the fire, entranced by the colored paper chains hanging from the tree branches. Merry Christmas, Lillian greeted him, her smile warm. Breakfast is nearly ready. Merry Christmas to you both, Gabriel replied, removing his coat and hat. It's a beautiful day out there. As they ate breakfast, Gabriel found himself watching Lillian more closely than usual. There was a nervous energy about her, a suppressed excitement that intrigued him. I have something for you, she said when they'd finished eating. Two things, actually. I wanted to wait until Christmas to give them to you. She disappeared into the side room, returning with two packages wrapped in scraps of fabric and tied with twine. They're not much, she said apologetically, placing them before Gabriel. But they're made with gratitude. Gabriel carefully unwrapped the first package to find a knitted scarf in a deep forest green, the wool soft and the stitches even and tight. Lillian, this is beautiful, he said, running his fingers over the fine work. When did you have time to make this? While you were out with the cattle, she explained, her cheeks pink with pleasure at his reaction. I unraveled one of my old shawls for the yarn. The second package contained a hand-bound ledger book, its pages neatly ruled for accounts and inventory. I noticed your old one was nearly full, Lillian said. I made this from paper I found in your desk. I hope you don't mind. The binding is from one of my old books that was falling apart anyway. Gabriel was speechless, touched beyond words by the thought and care evident in both gifts. I don't know what to say, he admitted finally. No one's made me anything in years. You've given us so much, Lillian said softly. I wanted to give something back, however small. Gabriel cleared his throat, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Well, I have something for you both as well, he said, retrieving the packages from beneath the tree. Samuel received his gifts, first the painted blocks, a small wooden horse Gabriel had carved, and a tiny sheepskin coat that had Gabriel sheepishly admitting, "Mrs. Peterson in town helped with the sewing. I'm afraid my skills with a needle are limited." Lillian laughed delightedly as she helped Samuel examine his treasures. "He loves them, Gabriel. Look how he clutches that horse." When it came time for Lillian's gifts, Gabriel found himself suddenly nervous. Would she think them too personal, too presumptuous? Lillian unwrapped each item slowly, her expressions shifting from surprise to pleasure to something deeper and more complex. The yarn made her smile with anticipation of future projects. The lavender oil brought a soft gasp of delight as she removed the stopper and inhaled its fragrance. But it was the fabric that rendered her momentarily speechless. "Gabriel, this is exquisite," she said finally, running her fingers over the floral pattern. "I haven't had a new dress since before Samuel was born." "I thought it might suit you," Gabriel said, relieved by her reaction. "The color reminded me of your eyes." The words slipped out before he could reconsider them, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken feelings. Lillian looked up from the fabric, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip. "There's one more thing," Gabriel said quickly, reaching into his pocket. "This isn't exactly a gift, more of a possibility." He handed her a folded document, watching nervously as she opened it. Confusion crossed her features as she scanned the legal text, then her eyes widened in shock. "Divorce papers?" she whispered, looking up at him. "How did you—" "I spoke with a lawyer in town," Gabriel explained, choosing his words carefully. "He said if Thomas is willing to sign, and I believe he is, you could be granted a divorce on grounds of abandonment. You'd be free, Lillian. Legally free to build whatever life you choose." Lillian stared at the papers in her hands, emotions playing across her face too rapidly for Gabriel to interpret. "You did this for me?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. "I did," Gabriel confirmed, anxiety building as he tried to read her reaction. "If I overstepped, I apologize. I just thought." His words were cut short as Lillian suddenly rose and moved around the table, kneeling beside his chair and taking his hands in hers. "No one has ever fought for me the way you have, Gabriel," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "No one has ever cared enough to give me choices instead of dictating my path." Relief flooded through him. "You deserve choices, Lillian. You deserve the chance to decide your own future." She squeezed his hands, a smile breaking through her tears. "What if I already know what I want that future to be?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Gabriel barely dared to breathe, afraid to presume too much yet hoping with every fiber of his being. "And what future would that be?" he asked, his voice low and rough with emotion. Instead of answering with words, Lillian rose slightly and pressed her lips to his in a kiss so gentle it might have been a whisper. Gabriel remained perfectly still for a heartbeat, stunned by the unexpected gesture, before responding with equal gentleness, one hand rising to cup her cheek. When they parted, Lillian's eyes were still closed, her expression one of wonder. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," she confessed, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Why didn't you?" Gabriel asked, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "I'm still a married woman," she reminded him. "And I didn't know if you felt the same way. You've been so kind to both of us, I couldn't bear the thought of misinterpreting that kindness for something more." Gabriel smiled, drawing her closer. "It was kindness at first," he admitted, "but it became something else entirely long ago. I think I started falling in love with you that first morning, when you insisted on helping despite everything you'd been through." "Love," Lillian repeated, her voice catching on the word. "Love," Gabriel confirmed, no longer afraid to name what he felt. "I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you care for Samuel, The way you've made this cabin feel like a home. I love you, Lillian Lawson. Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. And I love you, Gabriel Findlay. More than I thought possible after everything that happened with Thomas. You showed me what a good man truly is. Samuel chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal, drawing their attention. He had managed to pull himself up using the edge of the table and was watching them with bright, curious eyes. Gabriel laughed, the sound rich with happiness. I believe we have an approval, he said, reaching out to steady the baby. It seems we do, Lillian agreed, wiping away her tears. Though perhaps we should wait until the divorce is final before we discuss further arrangements. Of course, Gabriel nodded, understanding her desire for propriety. But know this, Lillian, whatever you decide, wherever you choose to go, my heart goes with you. Lillian rose and moved to lift Samuel into her arms, bringing him back to where Gabriel sat. We're not going anywhere, she said with quiet certainty. We're home. As snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, Gabriel knew he'd received the greatest Christmas gift imaginable, a family of his own, and the promise of a future filled with love. The weeks following Christmas passed in a whirl of quiet joy and tentative courtship. Though they had confessed their feelings, Gabriel and Lillian maintained a careful distance, both acutely aware of her still married status. They exchanged tender glances across the dinner table, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked together, but Gabriel was careful not to push for more than the occasional chaste kiss. January brought the coldest weather of the season, confining them mostly to the cabin except for essential chores. They passed the evenings reading aloud to each other from Gabriel's small collection of books, teaching Samuel new words and sounds, and planning for the spring planting. By unspoken agreement, they avoided discussion of Thomas or the divorce papers until news came from town. That news arrived on a bitter February morning when Sheriff Jim Reynolds made his way through the deep snow to Gabriel's ranch. The lawman's unexpected appearance sent a jolt of worry through both of them as they welcomed him inside. Sorry to intrude, Reynolds said, removing his hat and gloves. Would have sent word, but figured this was best delivered in person. What is it, Jim? Gabriel asked, offering the man coffee. Something wrong in town? Reynolds accepted the steaming cup gratefully before turning to Lillian. It's about your husband, Mrs. Lawson. Thomas was found dead yesterday morning behind the Golden Nugget. Lillian sank slowly into a chair, her face draining of color. Dead? How? Exposure. Looks like, Reynolds explained gently. He'd been drinking heavily, according to the barkeep. Must have passed out in the alley and just never woke up. The cold took him. Gabriel moved to Lillian's side, his hand settling on her shoulder in silent support. You're certain it was Thomas? He asked Reynolds. The sheriff nodded. No question. Found identification on him, and several people confirmed it. He turned back to Lillian. I'm sorry for your loss, madam. Lillian sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Thank you for coming all this way to tell me, Sheriff, she said finally, her voice distant, after Reynolds departed, promising to send word about funeral arrangements. Gabriel knelt beside Lillian's chair. Are you all right? He asked softly. I don't know what I feel, she admitted, her gaze fixed on some middle distance. Relief? Guilt? Sadness for what might have been? All of those, I think. She looked down at her hands. We were happy once, before the gold fever took him. He wasn't always a bad man. I understand, Gabriel said, and he did. Whatever Thomas had become, he had once been the man Lillian chose, the father of her child. Those facts deserved acknowledgement. Samuel will never know his father now, Lillian continued, her eyes filling with tears. I'm not sure if that's a blessing or a tragedy. Gabriel took her hands in his. You'll tell him the good parts, he said. The man his father was before. That's what matters. Lillian nodded, squeezing his hands gratefully. Thomas's death changes things between us, she said after a moment, meeting Gabriel's gaze directly. I'm a widow now, not a wife seeking divorce. Yes, Gabriel agreed, understanding the implications. Society viewed a widow differently than a divorced woman. The path forward was clearer now, if not easier. We should observe a proper mourning period, for appearance's sake if nothing else. Lillian's lips curved in a small, sad smile. Always so concerned with doing right by me. But yes, that would be appropriate. She paused, then added, though perhaps not the full year that custom dictates. Thomas and I were effectively separated these past months. Whatever you think best, Gabriel assured her, rising to his feet. There's no rush, Lillian. I'm not going anywhere. 3 days later, they made the difficult journey into Bannack for Thomas's funeral. The service was sparsely attended, a few curious townsfolk, the preacher, Gabriel, Lillian with Samuel bundled against her chest, and surprisingly, the saloon keeper who'd found Thomas's body. As they stood beside the simple grave in the windswept cemetery, Lillian remained dry-eyed and composed, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. Only Gabriel noticed how tightly she clutched his arm, her fingers pressing into the fabric of his coat as if anchoring herself against a storm. That evening, back at the ranch, Lillian finally allowed her composure to crack. After putting Samuel to bed, she returned to the main room and simply stood there, looking lost. He didn't even have a proper coat, she said suddenly. Did you notice? They buried him in that same threadbare jacket he wore when we arrived in Bannack. Gabriel set down the book he'd been pretending to read. Come here, he said softly, opening his arms. Lillian moved to him like a sleepwalker, allowing herself to be enfolded in his embrace. Only then did she begin to cry, not passionate sobs, but quiet tears that spoke of regret and the final release of hopes long abandoned. I kept thinking he would change back into the man I married, she confessed against Gabriel's shirt. Even after everything, some small part of me believed he might remember who he was before the gold and the drinking. Gabriel stroked her hair, saying nothing. Some pains needed no words, only presence. I feel guilty for being relieved, Lillian continued after her tears had subsided. Is that terrible of me? No, Gabriel said firmly. It's human. Your life with Thomas ended long before today, Lillian. You've already done your grieving. She nodded against his chest, then pulled back slightly to look up at him. Thank you for coming with me today. It would have been unbearable alone. You're never alone, Gabriel promised, brushing a strand of hair from her damp cheek. Not anymore. As winter gradually loosened its grip on the land, life at the ranch settled into a new pattern. Gabriel threw himself into preparations for spring, repairing fences damaged by snow, readying fields for planting, and checking on the pregnant cows that would soon deliver the season's calves. Lillian, observing a modified mourning period out of respect for appearances, wore her darkest dresses but allowed herself to plan for the future. Samuel grew and changed daily, now crawling with alarming speed and pulling himself up on furniture in determined attempts to walk. His first clear word, Gabe, had brought such a look of joy to Gabriel's face that Lillian had been moved to tears. By April, the snow had largely melted, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Lillian's mourning period, abbreviated though it was, had also come to its natural end. On the first truly warm day of spring, Gabriel found her in the vegetable garden, Samuel playing nearby on a blanket under the watchful eye of Kaiser. It's a perfect day, Gabriel observed, leaning on the fence that surrounded the garden plot. Lillian looked up from the seeds she was planting, shielding her eyes against the sun. It is, she agreed, a smile lighting her features. "Samuel and I were just talking about taking a picnic down to the creek later. Would you care to join us?" "I'd like nothing better," Gabriel replied, opening the gate and stepping into the garden. He glanced around at the newly turned earth and neat rows of early plantings. "You've accomplished a lot out here." "I enjoy it," Lillian said, sitting back on her heels. "There's something satisfying about nurturing things, watching them grow." Gabriel nodded, looking toward Samuel, who had discovered a fascinating pebble and was examining it with intense concentration. "I know exactly what you mean." Lillian followed his gaze, her expression softening. "He adores you, you know. His face lights up whenever you enter the room." "The feeling is mutual," Gabriel assured her, extending a hand to help her up from the ground. As she rose, he didn't immediately release her hand, instead drawing her slightly closer. "Lillian, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She tilted her head, curious. "Yes." Gabriel took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite having rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. "I know it hasn't been very long since Thomas passed, and if you feel it's too soon, I understand completely. But I can't imagine my life without you and Samuel in it." He reached into his pocket with his free hand, withdrawing a small object. "I'm asking if you'll marry me. If you'll make this family we've created official." In his palm lay a simple gold ring set with a small pearl surrounded by tiny emeralds. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was clearly of good quality and carefully chosen. Lillian stared at the ring, then up at Gabriel's face, her eyes wide. "Gabriel," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "My mother sent it when I wrote to her about you and Samuel. She said it should belong to the woman who brought joy back into my life." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. "You wrote to your family about us?" Gabriel nodded, suddenly uncertain. "Was that presumptuous of me?" "No," Lillian said quickly, a smile breaking through her tears. "It's wonderful. I'd given up hope of ever being part of a family again." "Is that a yes, then?" Gabriel asked, his heart pounding. Instead of answering immediately, Lillian glanced over at Samuel, who had abandoned his pebble and was watching them with interest. "Samuel," she called softly, "should we stay here with Gabriel forever? Should we become a real family?" Samuel babbled something incomprehensible, then clearly stated, "Gabe!" followed by his approximation of "Mama," that sounded more like MMA. Lillian laughed, turning back to Gabriel. "I believe that's a unanimous decision." "Yes, Gabriel Findlay, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, Gabriel slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant for her hand. "I promise to be a good husband to you," he vowed quietly, "and a good father to Samuel." "You already are," Lillian assured him, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his in a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. Samuel chose that moment to let out a squeal of delight, drawing their attention. To their amazement, he had pulled himself up using Kaiser's patient form and was taking his first wobbly steps toward them, his face a picture of determination. "Look!" Lillian gasped, dropping to her knees and holding out her arms. "He's walking." Gabriel knelt beside her, his heart so full it felt it might burst. "Come on, partner," he encouraged. "You can do it." Together, they watched as Samuel took 3 unsteady steps before toppling forward into their waiting arms. Their laughter mingled in the warm spring air as they embraced the child between them, a family in every way that mattered, now making it official. The wedding took place on a perfect June morning, the ranch adorned with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding meadows. Though the ceremony was small, attended only by a few friends from town and the circuit preacher who had ridden in for the occasion, it lacked nothing in sincerity or joy. Lillian wore a simple dress of pale blue, made from the fabric Gabriel had given her at Christmas, with her hair crowned by a wreath of daisies and sweet peas. Gabriel, uncommonly handsome in a new suit, held Samuel throughout the ceremony. The boy now steady on his feet but still preferring to be carried for important occasions. By the power vested in me, the preacher concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. As Gabriel kissed his bride, Samuel patted both their cheeks, bringing laughter from the small gathering of witnesses. I believe that's his blessing, Gabriel said, his eyes never leaving Lillian's radiant face. The first of many, I hope, she replied with a meaningful smile that set Gabriel's heart racing. That evening, after their guests had departed and Samuel was asleep in his new room, a proper addition Gabriel had built onto the cabin during the spring, husband and wife stood together on the porch, watching as the sun set over their land. Mrs. Findlay, Gabriel murmured, his arm around Lillian's waist. I don't think I'll ever tire of calling you that. I certainly won't tire of hearing it, Lillian assured him, leaning her head against his shoulder. It feels right, like I've finally found where I belong. Gabriel turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I want you to know something, he said solemnly. From this day forward, this ranch is as much yours as it is mine. I've had the papers drawn up. If anything were to happen to me, everything goes to you and Samuel. Lillian's eyes widened. Gabriel, you don't have to. I want to, he interrupted gently. You'll never again be at the mercy of circumstances or the whims of others. This is your home, your land. Always. Tears sparkled in Lillian's eyes as she reached up to touch his cheek. You are the finest man I have ever known, Gabriel Findlay. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. And you, my love, are the strongest woman I've ever met. It took remarkable courage to survive what you did, to protect Samuel when all seemed lost. I wasn't very courageous that night you found us, Lillian admitted softly. I was terrified and had almost given up hope. Almost, Gabriel emphasized. But you kept going. You kept fighting for your son. He drew her closer. That's what I fell in love with, first your indomitable spirit. As the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight, Gabriel led his wife back into their home, closing the door on the outside world. Tonight belonged to them alone, the first night of a lifetime they would build together. Epilogue 5 years later. Papa, look what I found. Gabriel turned from the fence he was mending to see 6-year-old Samuel racing across the barnyard, something clutched carefully in his cupped hands. At his heels trotted Kaiser, now gray-muzzled but still devoted to his small human charge. What treasure have you discovered today, Sam? Gabriel asked, setting aside his tools to crouch at the boy's level. Samuel opened his hands to reveal a tiny frog, its emerald skin glistening in the summer sun. Can I keep him? I'll take good care of him, I promise. Gabriel smiled, recognizing the same determined expression that often crossed Lillian's face. Well, frogs are happiest near water. Perhaps we could make him a home by the creek where you can visit him. Samuel considered this compromise with all the seriousness of his 6 years before nodding agreement. I'll name him Hopper. A fine name, Gabriel approved, ruffling the boy's dark hair so like his mother's in color, though he had his birth father's chin and eyebrows. Not that anyone would guess it. In every way that mattered, Samuel was a Findlay. Is Mama back with Emma yet? Samuel asked, carefully re-cupping his hands around his amphibian friend. Should be any time now, Gabriel replied, glancing toward the road that led to town. Why don't you put Hopper in a jar with some water for now, and we'll make his creek home after supper? As Samuel dashed off to find a suitable temporary frog residence, Gabriel resumed his work, one ear tuned for the sound of the wagon that would signal his wife and daughter's return. Lillian had taken 3-year-old Emma into Bannack for new shoes, the little girl having worn through her previous pair with remarkable speed. Bannack had changed considerably in the 5 years since Gabriel and Lillian had married. The gold that had initially drawn settlers was depleting, causing many miners to move on to newer strikes. The town had settled into a more stable community of ranchers, merchants, and those who preferred the quieter life of an established settlement to the chaos of a boom town. Gabriel and Lillian's ranch had prospered as well. With careful management and hard work, they had expanded their herd and their land. The cabin had grown into a proper house with separate bedrooms for the children, a larger kitchen where Lillian often taught neighboring women her preserved fruit techniques, and a covered porch where the family gathered on summer evenings. The sound of wagon wheels and Emma's delighted laughter announced the return of the rest of his family. Gabriel set down his hammer and walked to meet them, his heart swelling as it always did at the sight of his wife and daughter. Emma spotted him first. "Papa!" she cried, her golden curls so like Gabriel's in color bouncing as she bounced on the wagon seat. "I got red shoes. Look, red shoes, is it?" Gabriel replied with exaggerated amazement as he lifted her from the wagon. "Those must be the fanciest shoes in all of Montana Territory." Emma nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Wilson said so." Gabriel set his daughter down and turned to help Lillian, who was watching them with a tender smile. "And how are you feeling today, Mrs. Findlay?" he asked softly, his hand lingering at her waist as she descended from the wagon. "Very well," she assured him, her free hand moving instinctively to her slightly rounded belly. "Though your son or daughter has been quite active today." Gabriel's smile widened at the mention of their expected third child. "Must take after their mama, never one to sit still when there's work to be done." Lillian laughed, leaning up to kiss him briefly. "Speaking of work, I bought more fabric while we were in town. Emma will need new dresses soon. She grows faster than a spring colt." "Samuel found a frog," Gabriel informed her as they walked toward the house, Emma skipping ahead to show her brother her new shoes. "He's named it Hopper and agreed it should live by the creek. Another creature to add to his menagerie," Lillian said with fond exasperation. "Between the rabbit, the injured magpie he nursed back to health, and now a frog, will soon be running a wild animal sanctuary." "He has a kind heart," Gabriel observed. "Like his mother." Lillian's expression softened. "He has your patience, though, and your way with animals." As they reached the porch, Gabriel paused, drawing Lillian into the circle of his arms. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "Only twice," she replied with a teasing smile. "You're falling behind your usual count." "Well then, let me remedy that immediately," Gabriel murmured, bending to kiss her more thoroughly. "I love you, Lillian Findlay, more today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," Lillian whispered against his lips, "my shelter in every storm." From inside the house came the sound of children's laughter and the excited barking of Kaiser, bringing smiles to both their faces. "We should go in," Lillian said, though she made no move to leave Gabriel's embrace. "Supper won't cook itself." Gabriel nodded but tightened his hold slightly. "Just one moment more," he requested softly. "Let me look at you in this light. Sometimes I still can't believe you're really here, that all of this is real." Understanding filled Lillian's amber eyes. "It's real," she assured him, taking his hand and placing it over her heart. "We're real. The life we've built together is real. And it's more wonderful than anything I could have imagined that night you found us in the snow." Gabriel nodded, finally releasing her. "You know, for a man who once valued solitude above all else, I've become remarkably fond of a house full of noise and life." Lillian laughed, linking her arm through his as they climbed the porch steps together. "Just wait until this little one arrives," she said, patting her belly. "The noise has only just begun." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Gabriel replied with absolute sincerity as they crossed the threshold into their home, where their children waited, where memories had been made and more awaited creation, where love had transformed two broken souls into a family stronger than either could have fashioned alone.